You're listening to a program by Organization for Women's Liberation. My name is Susanne Norrie. This program is about 8th of March, International Women's Day. We're talking to Azar Monjadi, the chairperson of the Organization for Women's Liberation. Um, Everybody knows it's 8th of March, International Women's Day, and this is the topic of our discussion today. We're specifically going to concentrate on the situation of women in Iran, if that's okay with you, Azar.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, okay. Um, could you give us, to begin with, an overall picture of the situation of women in Iran, and then we might go into detail into some of the subjects. Thank you.
Well, I think more or less everyone knows that it's over 40 years now with the coming to power of the Islamic regime. A very clear and strong movement for women's rights, women's freedom, and against gender apartheid and Islamic rules have come to existence in Iran. Actually, from 8th of March of 1979, I mean, actually, just few, maybe less than a month after the Islamic regime took power in Iran, this movement came to life. Khomeini stated on 8th of March, early morning, that women have to observe the hijab going to work. And then women instead took to the streets in Tehran and demonstrated strongly against this ruling and against suppression of women. And one of the very interesting slogans they actually shouted that day was that women's right is neither Eastern nor Western. And then by Eastern, they meant Soviet Union, like Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc. It's universal. And that was actually a very interesting slogan women shout. And this phase lasted for 1 week. The regime had to set back and to attack a year later. And from that day, I've always said a new movement and strong women's rights movement or women's freedom movement was born in Iran. And ever since, this movement has continued fighting against the regime and its rulings and its misogynist actions and rules. It has had a lot of ups and downs for a period. It was almost like after 2-3 years when that big coup d'etat happened in for a whole decade, around 100,000 political prisoners, mostly left and communists, were killed in prisons. The women's rights movement was underground, but then started moving up again. And coming now, that was a very short history, and now coming into the past 3 years, which we are observing another strong movement by the workers, by ordinary citizens, against the regime, against poverty, against suppression, against censorship. Women's rights movement has become more lively again, and we've had a lot of actions by women's rights activists, and a lot of them have been taken to jail. And now when you look at Iran, even though hijab still is forced in Iran, and if you don't have it, you can be taken to jail or be beaten up, tortured. A lot of women now don't really observe the hijab in Iran, and it's just so vast that the security forces are unable to actually do anything about it. The fight against Islamic laws, against the hijab, against gender apartheid has been very, very vibrant in the society. I've always said that women's liberation movement in Iran is an antithesis of the Islamic regime and Islamic movement. This regime can never really see one peaceful day while it's in power, for all different reasons, the workers' movement, anti-poverty, all of that. secularist movement, and very much so because of the women's rights movement. And women's rights movement will not stop until this regime is in power.
Would you say that the focus of the women's liberation movement is or should be mainly against the hijab? Do you think that's a core demand in Iran, or would you say that it has to be more widespread against all sorts of misogyny and suppression of well, not just women but the working class and the people in Iran?
Well, basically, when you look at it, this movement is a very political movement, is against this regime, and hijab and gender apartheid are the main logos of this regime.
It's a
Hijab,
movement, you mean?
sorry?
Did you say it's the main slogan of the regime? You
Oh no,
mentioned
sorry,
the
I mean
movement.
movement. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
So actually, hijab is the banner of the Islamic regime, official banner of the Islamic regime and Islamic movement. We've seen that in the past 40 years, more than 4 decades. We've seen it in Iran, we've seen it in Afghanistan, Daesh, and all the whole region. And so, opposing gender apartheid and the veil are two main, very important demands. But of course, if you just stick to that, at this time, it's very, very clear that the regime will be changed in some ways, either by people's revolutionary and protest movement, and people will hopefully take control, or by the regime change policies of the imperialist governments, pole of terrorism like US and so on and so forth. And then they would bring another right-wing government. They, of course, would say, okay, no veil, no gender apartheid, and everything would be finished. This is the danger, of course, we are facing with. So it's important to keep these two slogans very strong and ask for complete equality and freedom of women, and try to deepen this movement and not allow that the superficial slogans or actions by some of the now so-called activists that are working with the foreign ministry of USA in the US to be sort of sabotaged. So it's tricky. It is tricky, but we've always tried in Organization for Women's Liberation to fight against Islamism, to fight against Islamic movement and Islamic regime, to fight against gender apartheid. I must actually mention that the term gender apartheid is from our movement. It was us who actually took this term and put it out there, and now it's become universal. Everyone is using it. But at the same time, to clearly expose all those movements, right-wing movements, the previous regime of the monarchies and the Shah, and what the United States and the West are trying to do, to actually expose them as well, so we would not become victims to them, and we become actually just parts and parcel of a regime change policy by the West.
You mentioned sabotage of the movement in Iran, the women's liberation movement in Iran. Could you expand on that a little bit more? Is it within Iran? Is it outside Iran? Is it a combination of both?
Well, it's, I think, combination of both. See, of course, you have class struggle in the society, and you have right and left. You have very right wings or Marxist and communist. And in Iran, actually, the socialist tendency is very strong. Anti-capitalist tendency is very strong among ordinary citizens, among the workers. Working class has very strong anti-capitalist tendencies. And right now, the fact the council or Soviet movement, if you like, and general assemblies have taken place all around Iran among the working class, and is expanding. But what could happen is that the West, or the pole of terrorism, imperialist powers, whatever you like to call them, under the leadership of the United States, would try to change this regime and bring another right-wing regime in Iran. And this is not the first time they've done it. They've organized a coup d'etat in the 50s against a nationalist government and brought Shah, who had fled Iran, back. In 1979, Islamic regime was not the product of people's revolution. It was actually the West, especially US, who brought Khomeini from it. They asked Saddam to send Khomeini out of Iraq. He came to France. They made him a leader. They brought him to Iran. They took Shah away and put the Islamists in power in the Cold War time as a sort of, as they called it, Brzezinski and Carter, a green belt against the Soviet Union. Just like they did with Taliban and Mujahideen in Afghanistan, or just they did with creating Daesh or ISIS 10 years ago. So they can do it again. They can do it again. And we have to, we know that, and we have to actually warn people and warn the activists that this could happen. And we have to be quite ready and clear not to allow that to happen. And one of the things they can use is women's rights movement, because women's rights movement is now very much focused against Islam and Islamic rules, rightfully. I'm not criticizing that. Rightfully, because of the gender apartheid, because of hijab, because of all the restrictions that Islam creates for women. But we have to go further. We have to be aware. We cannot find freedom in another dictatorship, be it this time a secular one. And I don't think they would even go that secular, because they do need Islam. They do need religion. Just look at the world. All of these right-wing governments, they have religion as one of their columns. And Shah's son, who really very much wants to become the next Shah, and they're trying to sort of make him a leader, he tries to actually defend Islam. So they know they cannot go against Islam and be able to totally oppress or suppress the leftists and the workers. They're aware. So this is a tricky situation that we have to really be aware of and be warned about, warn people and activists about.
So, in a sense, any progress by women's liberation movement against the Islamic regime in Iran would actually shake the pillars of the regime as a whole, would it not?
Yes, it would. I mean, see, in the past year, if you read the news and if you followed some of the medias in Iran, different powerful people in leadership, especially the mullahs, they come out and say it, that we cannot actually walk in the streets with our mullah clothes anymore. We are being attacked constantly. Women attack these mullahs. And they keep saying that we have to put women in their place, and all of that. So you see that they're constantly talking about the anti-Islamic movement in Iran, especially coming from women. And as I've said that like 2 decades ago, and I mentioned it here, I think really women's liberation movement is the antithesis of the Islamic movement and Islamic regime, and they cannot really in any ways live peacefully together. You cannot talk about women's rights and have a Islamic regime, or be under an Islamic movement, or even not accept some of the rules. So one of the bases of a regime in that region, especially everywhere, but now I'm talking about that region being under the Islam, is secularism. You have to actually separate the religion from state, from legislation, from executive power, from education, all of it, and make religion totally a private matter that cannot interfere in society with people's lives, and especially hands off children. This is what we have to say. So this is important, and we have to have that as one of our important and demands against the regime and for a future government.
So I just want to ask you about 8th of March in Iran. You mentioned the 1979 demonstration by hundreds and hundreds and thousands of women against the newly Islamic regime. How has it been since then? I know that it's got its ups and downs some years because of the degree of suppression. Women could not openly come out and demonstrate or announce their demands. But some years they felt a bit stronger. They could show their protest. How has it been recently? Are they able to have any sorts of events?
Well, as you mentioned, there have been times that there have been meetings or small sittings or small demonstrations, or we hear from different small gatherings in different cities. A couple of years, 20 something odd years, we had meetings in big halls in some cities in Iran. But no, we have not been able, activists have not been able to organize anything open and big. But I'm hoping an organization for liberation, its communique, has invited the activists to try and organize some kind of events, meetings, or some kind of protests in the streets against the regime and for women's rights. Now that actually the class struggle has deepened and the regime has had to has faced some setbacks, cannot attack as strongly as it could, still puts activists in jail, still tortures them, still executes some of them. It's not that it doesn't have power, but not the way it used to. So and now, for example, in the past few months, there have been teachers' movement and pensioners' movement, workers from different sectors like Haftape, like steel workers, like oil workers. Now that we've had that, I think probably we could try to venture and have something more open and in the streets or in meetings for 8th of March. We'll have to see. But it hasn't been, women's rights movement has not been able to organize anything big or open in the past decade.
I want to move on to International Women's Day as a universal day. Come out of Iran and just ask you, could you give us a very brief history of International Women's Day? How did it come about?
International Women's Day is a communist day. In 1910, in the Socialist Women's Conference in Copenhagen, Clara Zetkin suggested that this day become International Women's Day. It was in commemoration of the women workers in textile factory who were burned in the factory in New York. To commemorate those victims, those women, Clara Zetkin suggested that, and then next year, it became International Women's Day. And it was up to, I think, was in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, that UN decided to overtake that day and take it over from the leftist, socialist, communists. And then now many places they celebrate that day, and many it happens that there are some organizations or some women's movement in some parts of the world who probably even don't know the history or don't mention the history and try to celebrate women's rights or protest women's inequality, which is good. That's become international, but we shouldn't forget that. Just like 1st of May, which is a communist day, 8th of March is also a communist day. And it talks about equality, complete equality. And it talks about complete freedom of women. And this really, honestly, we've seen it by now, cannot happen complete and unconditional equality of women and men and freedom of women in a capitalist world. It can only happen in a socialist world. So we should remember that. Look at it. See, since capitalism, like 3 centuries or something since advent of capitalism, and very soon after advent of capitalism, we witnessed women's rights movement in different places, especially in Europe, of course, in the beginning. And women's workers, women's activists, they fought for the different change of law in the family, for votes for women, for some kind of equality between men and women. We had the suffragette movement. We've had the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s in the West. But one of the most important movements in the history is the women's rights movements in Russia and then Soviet Union after the 1917 revolution, which managed to have great achievements in the first 10 years of the revolution until the 30s, that actually socialism was defeated in Soviet Union, state capitalism came to power, well, Stalin took over, and many of those rights actually were taken back. Not all of it, but many of them. So this we've seen all of that throughout history, and we're still talking about women's rights. Maybe in Europe and in the West the situation has changed, but in most part of the world, look at Africa, look at the Middle East, look at Central and Southern America, still women are victims, still women are suffer from inequality. But what happened, another thing I'm just going to mention very briefly, is the past few years in this social media era, we coming to fore of the identity politics, we see a lot of superficiality in this movement and a lot of hatred creating atmosphere between men and women. And this is not how we address women's equality. Women's equality does not come about by hating men, by beating men up. No, we need equality and freedom in a world, in a system that does not need exploitation, does not need inequality, does not need hatred of different sections of the society in order to survive. And that's why I'm saying that the only way women can really reach complete freedom and equality is by trying to get rid of capitalism and creating a socialist world.
Okay, it's good that you mentioned Russian Revolution. That was my next question. The effects, the domino effects that huge revolution had in Europe. Would you say if the women's liberation movement in Iran rises and achieves its demands, as you mentioned earlier, in Iran, that would have an immense effect, a positive effect in the rest of the Middle East?
I'm sure it would. I'm sure it would, because actually the women's rights movement resonates in the Middle East. All those countries under the rule of Islam, the women fighting for their rights, or even men who want freedom and are for women's rights, they look at women's movement in Iran and get inspired by that. I've been in a lot of international conferences, and I've seen women from Syria, from Iraq, from other Middle Eastern countries who, when they know I'm from Iran, they come say, "Oh, Iranian women, they're so brave. They really feel inspired by the movement in Iran." And I believe once we get rid of the Islamic regime, if we can have a progressive regime in power, if people can take power in their own hands and not another right-wing government, we would be able to expand that movement into the Middle East, especially Afghanistan, our neighbor. Look what's happening to them. Taliban, and even before Taliban, many people keep just saying Taliban, but before Taliban, the situation of women in Afghanistan was really horrible too, but it's become worse. And we look at, they've actually, almost most women have been forced either to choose, or hijab has been forced on them. So it's really been taken back in North Africa and in the Middle East, where Islam has a very important role to play. And I hope that we could do that, we could achieve that, and we could try and inspire the whole region to get rid of the Islamic movements and to bring secularist and progressive regimes into power and push back all this tyranny, be it religious and political and economic.
I'm going to ask you a very difficult question now. We've only got 1 minute. If you were ruling the world, what would be the first thing you would do to get equality for women?
Well, the first thing we can do is just, you have to first announce it, first take all the backwardness and inequality out of the law and bring the law, and then after that try to create opportunities for women and especially young girls to take advantage of those laws.
Okay, thank you very much. That's
Thank
the end
you.
of our interview.
Thank you.